Good evening, everyone. 여러분 안녕하십니까? My name is So-young Greenberg, the Korean Language Programs Manager of the Korean Cultural Center. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's special session with Associate Professor Roald Maliangkay, Associate Dean of Korean Studies at the Australian National University. Tonight's talk is about Hangeul and K-pop. As some of you may be aware that Hangeul Day is coming up on 9th of October, and this is truly a rare opportunity to introduce the main features of Hangeul as well as the creator behind it. Also, its links to Korean popular culture, especially K-pop. Here with us tonight is also Director Jihee Kim of the Korean Cultural Center. She's got a greeting message to all the audience members. Director Kim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's event. And Professor Roald Maliangkay, thank you for giving us a lecture today. This Saturday, October 9th, is Hangeul Day. Hangeul Day is a day to commemorate the King Sejong's creation of the Korean alphabet Hangeul and the invention of Hangeul, which is very easy to read and write, has led to the spread of knowledge in Korea and the improvement of literacy in Korea. And Hangeul is also mentioned as the origin of the modern Korean culture today. Today, Professor Roald Maliangkay will give us a lecture on Hangeul and K-pop, and I really wonder what they have in common and what are the links between the two in his view. I look forward to an interesting lecture today. Thank you, everyone, once again. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me well. It's a great pleasure to be invited to talk about this fantastic system, Hangeul. And so I feel very honored. I'm very grateful to the Korea Cultural Center and specifically Director Kim Jihee, and of course the manager of all these programs, Kim So-young, as well. It is, it's a special day in Korea, and it has a long history, the celebrations. It was not long after the founding of the Joseon dynasty in 1418 that King Sejong ascended to the throne. He was a very ambitious man and a strong advocate for the teachings of Confucius. And so Sejong oversaw many advancements in science and technology, and it is unclear whether a culture of academic integrity, let alone in reports on royal affairs, was a thing at the time. But historian Youngie Kim Renault argues that the historical accounts pinpoint Sejong only as the sole person responsible for what is now celebrated annually in Korea today. Others, however, have argued that sometime in 1443, Sejong asked a group of Korean scholars to help him devise an alphabet that would allow the people to transcribe Korean alphabet phonetically, using sounds and ideograms rather than complex Chinese characters. Few Koreans had time to write anything elaborate, let alone something literary in nature. Few Koreans had time to do anything but look after their land, their craft, their trade, or things husbands and parents-in-law forced them to do. So their writing is likely to have been limited to names and numbers, including deaths. It doesn't mean, though, that they wouldn't have been served by a good alphabet. So as the elite had long relied on the Chinese writing system, the sounds used in Chinese and Korean differed significantly, as we all know. And so with the former system complicating the transcription of foreign sounds. What is more, the Chinese required, and still does, a considerable amount of training and practice. A simple phonetic script would solve those issues. So on October the 9th, today, in 1446, the new script was formally announced to the public. Hunminzong. Let me just share that with you. It is indeed this day that makes Hangeul Lal, right? Lal day, Hangeul is the Korean script. The name Hangeul did not, however, come into use until much later. It was coined in the early 20th century by scholar Jihee. The system is, by any account, a remarkably clever and hyper-modern system that, as you know, delightfully stands out from many others due to its unique shapes and its incorporation of basic phonology. What provided the inspiration for the alphabet and the Korean phonemes is unclear. The sounds K, N, S, and may be obvious when you look at how they are shaped. And so for this, they use this interesting kind of idea of basically a face and kind of the shape of your tongue or your mouth when you were pronouncing particular letters or sounds, making particular sounds. And so the shape of your tongue or your mouth then served as the example or the phoneme that eventually found its way in the alphabet. That's all wonderful. And it's very early for any system to consider these kind of phonological concepts. But the letter A, for example, the R, not so much, unless someone can show me how to fold my tongue into a R shape. Probably have to drink quite a bit of makgeolli to achieve that. It is possible that inspiration was taken from alphabetic writing systems from Iran or India, Mongolia or China. The Korean symbols do not show much resemblance to their characters, but historian Gary Ledyard argues that Sejong and his scholars are likely to have taken the principle of an alphabet and perhaps a few letter shapes from those systems. Originally, the Korean system comprised 28 letters. Today's Hangeul, as you can see here, and I've taken this slide from a poster that we sometimes use in, at our university for events related to the Korean language, contains 24 letters, 14 consonants and 10 vowels. One special vowel and 3 consonants have been dropped because their sounds were no longer clearly identifiable in the vernacular. But who was this new system intended for primarily? Although slight adaptations of Chinese in the form of Idu and Hangeul systems were introduced in the 15th century, the elite maintained classical Chinese as their primary means of written communication in virtually all areas for more than 500 years. The application of Hangeul was actually very limited, and the first book to be published using Hangeul was Nehun, which raises the possibility that the system was conceived partly as a self-development tool for elite women rather than a system that allowed commoners to communicate through writing. And here in this slide, and hopefully you can see it without any problems, you can see what Nehun was about. And I sometimes show this to my students who usually react in horror at some of the things that are suggested here. For good reason. Now, by the end of the 19th century, Hangeul began to be increasingly used in periodicals, though the elite would continue to show off their oft Japanese university degree-based knowledge by way of Chinese characters well until the 1980s. Clark Sorensen notes that class distinctions were strong around the turn of the century. There were, he points out, these distinctions based on wealth, but at the same time, there were these kind of old old ideas around hierarchy that were based on traditional Confucian ideas of kind of the scholar being at the top, and then the farmer, the craftsman, and finally the merchant being kind of socially at the bottom.
Sorry,
Now,
I'm sorry about that. Is the slide, are the slides supposed to be changing, or is that just the first page? I've got some questions coming through.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me just check the slides. They should be changing.
We're still on the front page.
Ah, I see. Hang on. I'll just try something else. Can you see this? This would be the second slide?
Yeah, it's changing now. Yeah,
Good.
the second slide.
Okay, good. So thank you. So if I may just go through them quickly in case you missed them. So this is the Hunminjeon, as it was called at the time it was announced. So the correct, I guess, for the instruction of the people, the correct sounds. Hunminjeon. And here you see that slide that shows the shape of the sounds in your mouth and how they ended up in an alphabet. Hopefully this is clear as well. This is the slide showing the thing we use at ANU when we have events related to Korean language. So these are the 24 characters of the alphabet. And this is Nehun. And so here are those concepts that sometimes shock my students for good reason. So during the colonization of Korea from 1910 to 1945, the Japanese sought to replace the indigenous vernacular with Japanese. The middle and upper classes would eventually become literate in Japanese and quite soon actually achieve this. But women often achieved that literacy a little bit later on average, which meant that the many marketing schemes aimed at women tended to be a little bit careful. So they adjusted their advertising in such a way that there was no confusion possible. Which meant that a lot of the ads you see in the 1910s and 20s, when Japanese was still not really, at least common for everyone, a lot of the ads had several languages at the same time. You can see this, that the ads don't play so much with the Korean typography as a result, which is, in a sense, perhaps a bit of a letdown. And when you go through old newspapers from Korea, there's a lot of advertisements, but playing with fonts, with the shape of letters is actually not very common throughout the colonial period. And so I guess there was this idea, though there may be other reasons, that it would be a little bit risky. You wanted the message to be conveyed as efficiently as possible. And so if you wanted to play with things, you would play with things around the text, not with the text, with I guess, the message itself. So here is one example of that. Another one is here. You see how on the right-hand side, top right corner, you see uri, uriga. And the U has been turned basically into lines where the kind of the horizontal line also serves to underline the rest of the text. But these things really are rare. So I've been going through so many advertisements to try and find examples. I really couldn't find any beyond these two. When you look at Japanese, on the other hand, you find a lot of play with fonts and with the shape of characters at the very same time, even in Korea, but not with Hangeul. Until the 1930s, the process of replacing Korean with Japanese was an arguably steady but subtle one. Because the use of Hangeul was seen as nationalistic, from the 1930s onwards, many members of the Korean language society were imprisoned. And as is well known, from 1938 onwards, the use of Korean in classrooms and in public gatherings was banned. Following the defeat of Japan and then the ensuing Korean War from 1950 to 1953, language in what were now North and South Korea developed differently. In 1949, Kim Il-sung officially decreed an end to the use of Chinese characters and their replacement by Hangeul in all areas. Pyongyang regarded Hanja, the use of Chinese characters alongside Hangeul, as a symbol of flunkyism, and they eliminated Chinese characters from all publications. It also created new words of exclusively Korean origin, so words that may have been originally based on usually based on nouns, Chinese nouns, and then compound nouns, were replaced with like kind of clean Korean versions. North Koreans refer to their language as a cultured one, and they regard the regional dialect of Pyongyang as the standard. Curiously, I find if you just look at the script itself, that in North Korea, there's actually a very limited number of styles that you see on a daily basis. Most items and publications use a very cursive kind of serif-based type, which you kind of see on the right-hand side here. You also find that same style, this kind of cursive style, but without a serif. So the sans serif, as they say, version. But usually handwriting. And that cursive style may be intended to compete, perhaps, aesthetically with Chinese. It may also be kind of invented or used because it suggests a more personal, non-technological, non-digital, therefore analog touch, which may be better suited to the propagation of ideology. Another example is this one. This is kind of modern, and there's a little bit of nice kind of character play in this game. It's not a North Korean game. I believe it's a Chinese game, Gangram, but I could be wrong. The box itself has a kind of a nice play on characters, on fonts. So there is more, of course, but still the number of styles tends to be rather limited. In South Korea, the policy for the use of Hangul has fluctuated with each regime. Up until the early 1980s, school children were taught Chinese characters in mixed script, Hanja, as they continue to be used in some newspapers and in academic manuscript. But President Tam Do-hwan, so from 1980 to 1988, he had them removed again from the school curricula, and then they were again reintroduced under Kim Dae-jung, who was there from 1998 to 2003. And so today, because of the importance of China, a lot of people are learning Chinese, of course, and so the use has come back, as everyone knows. There's also an enormous variety of fonts and that you can find in everyday life, and it's constantly expanded, and it's just wonderful to walk through Seoul and just look at all the billboards and all the advertising and see how much play there is just with the characters, with the typography. So just to give you a couple of examples, these are just some company names and some, I guess, some titles. This is a kind of famous example. If you don't know what this says, then I'll have to click again and you'll see what it actually says. The personal favorite. Unfortunately, the shop here, which is not far from Gyeongbokgung, has disappeared since. But I love the play on the 서서, standing and eating, 서서 here, because inside, if you went into this tiny little restaurant, you actually had to stand at a bar, kind of like the characters show you. So it's kind of like a pictogram almost. So it's very kind of interesting to look at. And there's this, I enjoy just the play on the font itself. And then of course I am MKR, makgeul, right? And this had to be there, and you might have thought, is he going to mention it? Well, he is. And of course, the circles perhaps deserve this mention. So the motivation that long drove the use of Chinese characters among the elite is not actually that different from that driving foreign fans of K-pop. Language can entail privileged information. People are keenly aware of the social significance of their achievements and decisions. Our consumption is driven by our taste, our income, and our position on social political issues. Those factors allow us to earn praise from like-minded peers, either people who share our individual ambitions and exclusive position, or people who belong to the social class to which we aspire to belong. Social media have made it possible to publicly share both our feeds, our unusual experiences, Instagrammable smorgasbords, or our latest shoe purchases, and our praise for such things. And we all enjoy praise, regardless of class. Though I guess the pressure will decrease as we age or move up in the world, or both, which is usually the case, which is why older people and parents tend to care less about what's hot and what is new and so on than young people. So being regarded as out of tune means young people don't embrace, or at least could suggest that young people don't embrace those neoliberal ideals or embrace them enough. But the fear of missing out, to which this is connected, is a 21st century term to describe pressures that have existed for a long time and probably existed well before Hangeul was invented, and probably affected both illiterate peasants and even some of the scholars around King Sejong. Because of limitations on time and opportunity, however, we may not always seek out the most significant feat we can add to our tally. It is the basis of conformity, and we shouldn't regard that as any kind of, or any form of complacency per se. Regardless of the amount of effort they dedicate to pursuing public feeds, most of us conform to a pattern of behavior that best reflects their social political aspirations, which tend to be limited by their social cultural habitus. To cite Baudrillard, he says, "It is invariably oneself that one collects." So to add a foreign flavor to one's collection of feats, achievements, or experiences, or to devote oneself entirely to music like K-pop from a different culture can have a positive effect on a person's kind of personal image, the image they have within their cultural surroundings. It can suggest that one is knowledgeable about music in general and critical of the music that is played by the mainstream media. It also allows people insight into a realm that may be unknown to most of their peers. To be involved in an activity that enables people to connect with others from different cultures can be very attractive, especially when it requires a challenge or many hours of dedication, as any foreign language does. So there's a significant amount of empowerment that comes from having the knowledge required to engage with a well-known, highly regarded, but foreign form of culture. It calls to mind the words "push this end" in an ad for a brand of cigarettes from 1899, where it served no purpose other than providing a defining challenge to the educated reader. And I know this is quite a jump, but what you see here is an ad, an old ad that basically includes "push this end." And anyone who kind of knew what this was about saw this as a positive challenge. It was like, hey, I know these English, these foreign words, I know what they mean, and I know what they actually suggest. Even though "push this end" just meant, you had to push it in order to open the box. wasn't anything special, but the person who knew probably felt a little bit proud of himself. And the ad, as a result, was a nice little challenge, and it suggested that you had to be knowledgeable in order to be part of this community of cosmopolitan smokers. So this engaging with a foreign culture doesn't require much investment. When Hollywood movies include Korean language, and I'm thinking of Cloud Atlas, Colossal, World War Z, Moon, Avengers, Age of Ultron, and Black Panther, it isn't so much a genuine understanding of Korean that these movies kind of expect from the viewers, but merely an awareness of Korea being a hyper-modern and technocratic nation, and if not that, then at the very least, a very wealthy one. Even foreign musicians sometimes adopt Korean script in their music videos. And I'll leave it up to the fans of their songs to explain exactly how the Korean text should be interpreted and what associations are implied. So although K-pop continues to be sung primarily in Korean, English words and phrases have always been an important feature. An early example of a song that had one phrase in English at a key point was Seo and Boyce's Come Back Home from 2005. Although the lyrics were otherwise entirely in Korean, the refrain ended with the foreign title phrase, which suggested some correlation with the rest of the lyrics, despite serving a mostly acoustic function. Countless other acts, as we know, followed suit and began to also regularly include English words or phrases in the chorus of their songs, even though they would have first been heard by and targeted at Korean, Chinese, or Japanese audiences. But somehow the genre stuck with what was primarily an aesthetic, lyrically, phonetically, and culturally, if not always semantically. The English sections in K-pop lyrics do not appear to represent a translation of Korean words or phrases. Perhaps as a way of demonstrating the genre's independence from Western culture, when they are included, K-pop songs do not aim for any poetic lyricism per se, even though they often play with words and imply new meanings. It may therefore seem as though the words used are selected at random, but of course they never are. The foreign words do not always correlate well, though, with the remaining lyrics, but they may help express a mood reflected in the accompanying lyrics or music video. I guess a noted example is the phrase, "Hey, sexy lady," in the refrain of Psy's 2012 global hit Gangnam Style, which many non-Korean speakers would gleefully recite, appreciating the sentiment, but really without having any idea what the song was really about. A second reason for people to pursue learning another language may be that it allows them access to a previously inaccessible one. Such access may have no implications within their own social environment, but can be driven more by personal, emotional motivations and requires no performance of any social cultural background or taste. Despite being a bit of a cultural snob, Bourdieu was right in arguing that the enjoyment of music by audiences entailed an acquired subconscious performance that classifies their identity more than any social activity. A melody, he would argue, is perfect not so much because of the tears it brings to your eyes the first time you hear it, but because in your youth, you have learned to appreciate its beauty and you are now overtaken by the miracle of this perfect rendition. Passion, in other words, is by and large a social construct that is ultimately for show and confirmation. However, Simon Frith is right as well, I think, in arguing that music can be enjoyed despite you maybe rationally not agreeing with it or to it. Indeed, Antoine Aignan warns that there's always the possibility that the music kind of hits you, that it's like a new arrival, a relatively irreducible thing. It happens, it passes, and even though you can't always pin it down and bring it in line with something that you might feel is more authentic, it might still move you. So now imagine being able to speak the language of your ultimate idols in their own language, or speaking to the mechanics responsible for putting together that racing car of your dreams. Sure, you could share the experience on social media, you think, but what if you were asked never to share it? Wouldn't many people go ahead anyway? The global success of K-pop hasn't led to a massive increase in English lyrics. Ironically, the millions of foreign fans of K-pop these days probably prefer the songs without. The special knowledge required to fully engage with a song and video provides access to a community of peers. Their shared denial of the value of their respective mainstream cultures feeds a subculture, which, at least on a superficial level, may defy the rules of the ideology that dominates locally. The fact that the fans may have very different backgrounds representing vastly different social classes and backgrounds does not therefore constitute a kind of challenge to the hierarchy of fan bases, since their actions are valorized by the peers within those fan bases. One of the ways in which fans can ascend within that hierarchy is by demonstrating true commitment and an understanding of the social cultural circumstances that surround the idols and their art. So in communication, such fans may use a fair number of Romanized terms that the community finds are best left untranslated. These are now called 돌민정음, which is a bit of a portmanteau of idol and 훈민정음. So they include terms such as 막내, which is usually the youngest sibling, but is now also used to refer to a new fan club member, and oppa, a term that is often misunderstood as meaning any older male of the same generation.
아니야, 물을 안 넣었잖아.
아, 무슨 소리 하는 거야?
아니야, 물은 안 넣는다니까? 그래서 우리는 물에다가 이거
언니.
익었는지만 확인했잖아.
물 넣어.
물 넣는다고? 아니야, 물 안
못
넣어.
살겠다. 봐봐요. 제가 없으면 돌아가는 게 없어요. In Korea, one of the first things you ask other than your name is how old are you? And as soon as they say you're older than you, it's like, oh, you're 언니. So 언니 is basically what you called her an
맞아.
older sister. It's like
외국은 그런 게 없어.
we don't
같이
call
쓰잖아.
each other by names.
맞아.
It's normally 언니 if you're older than me, and oppa if you're a guy. It takes a while to get used to, but once you get a hold of it, it's better than calling like their names. Like she's not Chisu, she's 언니. It's like family in a way.
Perhaps not surprisingly, some of the early examples of Hangeul in K-pop videos have been pictograms that represent letters from the alphabet, which are very popular in informal communication through email or SMS. So you see a whole list here in this slide, which hopefully you can see, but please let us know if it's not showing up. And of course, the first few probably everyone is familiar with by now. And I've seen even some of my colleagues who have nothing to do with Korean studies use some of these kind of as a joke when they're communicating with me. So even they seem to be aware of them, which is fun. And what I like about these is that they are, of course, not only onomatopoeias in that they represent sounds, but they also represent images in it. So if you take the first one, it sounds like ooh, you, for example, or you. Now they could be closed eyes that are tearing up, but the sound, of course, is also the sound of crying. And so they're very clever little ways of expressing that you're sad for something or about something without using an emoticon. I don't think there's a word for them, so I would like to propose alphabetograms. Yes, that's now mine. Sometimes these appear in music videos too.
여러분, 2333년 미래도시 데이바이데이 뮤직비디오 잘 보셨는지요? 근데 저희는 사실 여러분께서 많이 사랑해 주시지 않으면 어떨까 하고 굉장히 마음고생스럽습니다. 그렇지만
Here's another example. It's actually, and I guess this sounds like a bit of a letdown. It is actually very rare to see Hangeul in K-pop music videos, but there are exceptions.
어떻게 하면 나쁘지 않으야 아무치게 내뱉지 말고 소리를 쳐봐 뭔 소리야 이게 웃긴 얘기야 참 어이없게 적을 때 생각나
And of course the next one, which I couldn't miss. You would hate me if I did. So sure, there are some videos that use Hangeul. Now, in light of some of the controversies around the foreign source of their compositions and the props used in music videos, idols and their management, would like to remind you of the uniqueness of their culture and perhaps lure you further in with their offer of cultural capital. And they certainly haven't used Chinese script to achieve that. But what puzzles me still a little is the relatively kind of little use of Hangeul in K-pop videos, and why videos so often only have the title of the song or the name of the idol group in Korean at the very end. So there's this one, and this one. There's this one, and then there's this one. But these only appear at the very end of the video, not at the start either. Still, they're very creative, and so it's nice to see these kind of artistic final slides, if you like. Might K-pop agencies worry perhaps that expanding the use of Hangeul beyond these end titles may raise concerns over the products requiring more than knowledge of a few words? It would certainly seem so. Music videos could be regarded as ads for songs, and as such, playing with typography would be a risky endeavor, as it might confuse the target audience. But then K-pop videos are not so much ads for the product, they are the product, which means that a little more play ought to be allowed. There are several possible explanations for the lack of this Korean script in Korean music videos that at least I can think of. One may be that since many of the lines that make up the bridge or the chorus are habitually sung in English, there aren't too many good phrases to portray in Hangeul. Another may be that in competing with similar foreign acts, K-pop agencies may share a concern that including too many Korean elements will make it impossible for the video to compare favorably. Now, either for being regarded as too proud or nationalist, something that Chinese consumers have flagged in the past as being a bit off-putting, or for being too apologetic, using Korean references only as a way of saying, hey, I'd like to be judged based on merit, but please consider, my background, consider where I come from. And that, as we know, this often is used, at reality talent shows in Korea, but also in Australia, where, the best background story actually, earns the contestant a lot of extra points, or text messages. And it's also actually something that worked for example, the Kim sisters back in the 1960s, wherever they performed, in all their advertising, they would say, we come from Korea, which was, which was bombed a lot. We were in a war situation. We had to escape. And you can find that in a lot of their kind of advertising from the 1960s, newspaper articles. They often mentioned that they had come from a place of severe, let's say, hardship, and that America was giving them wonderful opportunities. And so that may be something the K-pop agencies wish to avoid. And it's not that unlikely, because since, for example, the 1980s, when I started focusing on Korean art, I often found that Korean artists at exhibitions overseas, at galleries, they would highlight the fact that they were from Korea rather than discuss their kind of individual artistry or their individual interpretation, presumably because the conditions for their overseas travel, this was at a time that Koreans were not yet allowed to freely travel overseas, probably urged or at least convinced them to assume the role of ambassadors. And that stuck for quite a while. But a third and perhaps most plausible reason for the lack of Hangeul in music videos is that too much Korean language could ostracize the potential fan, seeing as virtually all the songs remain sung in Korean. The balance between Western-inspired music and video settings on the one hand, and then on the other, the Korean idols and their lyrics would then be kind of lost. There may well be other reasons, but I would like to leave those up to the fans to contemplate. Although I'm a huge fan of the Korean alphabet, I'm already very pleased that millions of people around the world are listening to Korean language. And if some of them think, like me, that it actually looks fantastic too, I certainly won't be complaining. Thank you.
Wow, there was a lot of information, and remember some of the old advertisements that you found somewhere I haven't really seen myself, and some of the information that I didn't know at all while growing up from South Korea and born and growing up in South Korea. So in the meantime, we've got lots of comments and question and answer. Would you like to pick some of the questions and answer some of them if you would you? Yeah, can you see them?
Oh, thank you for everyone who has to leave. Thank you so much for joining. It's an honor to talk about this to you. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so I can't say with you. But thank you for joining. Let me go to the top of this list. One question here is, how do Korean people learn Hangul? That's actually a very good question. So as an English speaker learning Korean, we use romanization. Indeed, is it more so a pictorial thing for Korean people? Yes, I think it is. And we now I think in Australia, mostly people are starting to move away from teaching Korean to Australians without the romanization. And so, which is why foreigners tend to be much better at romanizing perfectly, at least until recently. Because Korean people don't really always need the perfect romanization. They will be able to romanize things, but they may not have an idea of the perfect use of the revised romanization system, or the one that was always popular with academics, the McCune-Reischauer system. And over time, the books have improved so much that now the books actually make it possible, indeed, as the question suggests, to use it in to use the language in a kind of pictorial fashion, where we go very slowly and we actually just start with the alphabet from day one. So we can avoid romanization. Romanization still has its use, for one of them, for example, is the pronunciation of things. So sometimes it is actually quite hard to work out how something is pronounced, and then it's helpful to be able to have the romanization there. So I actually provide a chart to my students in case we're not there, or in case they can't find it on an app or the internet, because the tools are so amazing these days. The kind of written charts may not even be necessary anymore. But yeah, so we're moving away from romanization. It is possible, long story short. Thank you.
Thanks. What about other questions on the question box?
See, one interesting one here, and I won't call people's names. I hope you don't mind. It's just for privacy reasons, but thank you for your questions. Since Hangeul is primarily used in the day-to-day now, do you think Hanja will slowly, fully phase out of use? It's an excellent question. I don't think so. I think because Koreans are very proud of their history, and because Chinese has for so long influenced the Korean language and continues to influence the Korean language, I don't see it disappearing. But there was a time, and that's probably the early 2000s, when I guess very few people were concerned with Chinese language. Now, because China is so important economically and politically, you see a lot more people studying Chinese, and that wasn't the case 20 years ago. And also, of course, simply for business purposes, because there's a lot of Chinese people coming to Korea. So there's good reasons to just study the language, even if you don't want to really go into the script. But it does help. So I don't think it will go away. And I personally also, I like Chinese language too. I love Hangeul, but I also like Chinese characters. And I think it's actually wonderful when we can use them together, because that makes the Korean language so kind of colorful and diverse and unique. So, and you don't need to just stick to an alphabet to be unique. Let me go to another question. Let's see, and I hope I answered them well enough. How was Sejong able, someone asked, to educate everyone on the new writing system? Was it first the upper classes, and how did the lower classes learn it? Yes, excellent question. Upper classes, I would say. I don't think many people, as I said at some point, really had time to learn Chinese, or the Hunminzongan, and you don't see a lot of sources even referring to it for many years. And then if you look at the late 19th century, that's when you see it coming up, and then periodicals are starting to use them. But a farmer, on average, wouldn't have time or even money left to spend on fancy periodicals. So I don't think it was for anyone but the elite or people who wanted to be part of the elite. And so people who were able to go to the Confucian schools, for example. Let me go to another. Was there a difference in the Chinese education system at the point Hangeul was created? Just to the extent that if it was partly devised as a simple sin to get around the problems of mass illiteracy, was that also a problem that China faced at that time, or did they solve this issue in another way? Good question. I can't really comment on China. I believe they had proper national exams, though, for a long time, which means that it wasn't really exclusive to the elite, which is a little bit different, and the historians will probably kill me for saying this, from the Korean system, which seems to have been much more exclusive to an elite network of families. And so to rise up from a nobody to a somebody in Korea, I believe was harder than in theory it was in China. And what that meant for the education of language, I can't say in regards to China. I'm not a sinologist, but in Korea, of course, there were all kinds of schools to educate women too. Giseng, who, for example, performed medical services for the court, and of course for men too. And so there were all kinds of Confucian schools as well as institutes for women. And so at those institutes, but again, as part of a kind of an elite system, people would be able to study Chinese, and it may have been mostly women in the early stages, and Hangeul, or Hunminzongan as it was first called. There's an interesting question here, which is more about pop. Do you think that now, as Korea is establishing itself in the world as not only an economic power, but also cultural power, that we will see Hangeul used more in K-pop music videos and Korean pop culture in general, even if it's marketed internationally? Yeah, I would expect this to be the case. And yet I've been, for this talk, I actually had surprising to me myself. I had a fair amount of time to prepare, and I went through hundreds and hundreds of K-pop music videos to double check any mention, any use of Hangeul. The ones I found, I have shown to you. So that's not a lot. So because it's so little, I guess in terms of mathematics, the chances of it increasing are great because it's so little. But whether it really will take off, I'm not sure. I think people are intrigued by Squid Game, for example, which, because it's such a different, possible different type of audience, it may well be. It may well be, especially since the poster, of course, has that that circle character. It may be, people may be studying this. I don't know, it may be. I kind of hope so, of course, because it empowers people like you asking this question. You probably have a very good understanding of Korean culture, and that empowers you. You can explain it to other people. Someone asked, is there a program in Australia for Korean studies? Yes, there are several, and there are really good ones too. And so I represent, I guess, to a degree, I represent the ANU in Canberra. There's a really good one in Perth as well. There's two excellent ones, just as good, in Melbourne at Monash and Melbourne University. There are two big ones in Sydney, of course, at Sydney University and University of New South Wales. There are wonderful people at UTS in Sydney as well. There's Queensland. And then if you fly across the border, there are also a few wonderful institutes in New Zealand where they do great work. And so every institute has a kind of a few specialties, if you like. And so if you're interested in coming to a particular city to study Korean studies, have a good look, speak to someone. Most people are actually very nice, surprise, surprise, and they would love to have you. So if you're interested and you have a particular interest, just shoot an email over to me or one of my peers around Australia, and I'm sure you'll hear back from them very quickly. Let me have another look. So I'm going through the list here.
There's so many, actually.
There's a lot of fantastic questions. Do you have a favorite Korean word? I do, actually. I have a few, but and don't shoot me for this, but they're actually loan words, but they sound so cute. So my old buddy from when I was studying at Yonsei, his favorite word was the bone, because he thought it was such a cute, short little word. And I also like that one very much. But then I saw the word hot dog in Korea, hot dog, and I just thought it was so cute. And you see this sometimes on, outside these pet stores, hot dog, and they always give me they make me smile. I just love that word. Yeah, they tend to be loan words, and not because I laugh at Koreans, but I kind of laugh at how silly some of these words are in their original language. So yeah, there's a fair number, and I always throw them at my students as a way of getting them to really adopting the Korean sounds, because it's so natural to fix the Korean pronunciation of loan words. So they might say, hot dog, blah, blah, blah. And I go, no, it's hot dog, hot dog. And I like doing that because it just reminds them that that's not what it is. It's double cheeseburger, right? It's not a double cheeseburger. So, and to get into that mindset, I think is very important for our students. So we say everything the Korean way, even if they're loan words. Don't fix them. I'm just going to go, is there a difference with how North and South Korea write their Korean language? I guess there are small differences. For example, North Korea tends to often put a ril at the start of certain words that aren't always pronounced as such. In South Korea, they tend to write them, for example, with just a y sound or an L sound, whereas in for example, a sound like young might be written ryong in North Korea, but you wouldn't really say that in North Korean either. So there are small differences in the spelling of names in particular, but also in some, let's say, normal words that aren't names. There are a lot of Konglish terms, someone writes. When did this really start incorporating English terms into Korean? It's a great question. So as you can probably guess, it started around the time of the Korean War, when a lot of Americans, but not just Americans, Thai, for example, some Australians came to Korea. And they interacted with Koreans, and they had wonderful friendships. And so, and of course, even the people who spoke other languages probably used English quite often in communicating with the locals. And you see that the government is not really ready to do anything about all these new loanwords coming through. And so it isn't until roughly, I believe, the early 1970s that a new institute, I believe it was 1971 roughly, when they started to do this. I could be wrong. Something called the Kumyeon Yuli Yuane It's the Public Performance Screening Committee was established and started to put out publications where they listed the correct foreign word for foreign items. So instead of saying, for example, laptop or something, they said notebook, something like that. So there were all these lists, and sometimes they corrected things quite late. So if you go through them, and I've done this a few times, you go to, for example, 1978, and they have these whole lists, and you see that words that have been in use for quite a while should probably no longer be used, and then they cross them out and they have a nice new list. This is now the correct word. So this is now the word that we're supposed to be using. So it's a bit like the Alliance Française, which does that for French, as you know. So they also have these efforts to kind of keep the French language clean. And Korea has done that too for quite a while. So I guess it's the late 60s, early 70s that really takes off. Okay. Do you catch up on new K-pop songs? If so, what's your favorite? Finally, yes, we talk about music. I don't really have, perhaps I should, but I have the most eclectic, I guess, taste in music that shocks anyone, including K-pop fans and fans of hard rock and classical music. I'm kind of a trained violinist. So I was actually going to have a career as a violinist, and then decided to do Asian studies instead. So, but I was also playing percussion in funk bands. So I have this massive collection of funk music, rock, K-pop. And so what am I listening to now at the moment in terms of K-pop? It tends to be somewhat older songs. I still like FX quite a lot, I must say. I like the Wonder Girls. I like BTS. I liked SHINee for a while as well. And so I'm a bit slow, if you like, because every time I introduce something that I've just discovered, my students go, oh my God, that's so embarrassing. Please don't tell me you're my teacher. And yeah, because I catch up late, but there are wonderful, there's so much. So I think I'm okay to be a little bit slow. I think a lot of stuff is worth re-exploring, and that's my defense. Are there more words with German influence beside part-time jobs? Yeah, there is one which I had to look up in countless dictionaries, for example, for years, and no one knew the answer. Korean linguists at SOAS, where I studied, couldn't come up with the answer. And that's the word koribungen. Yes, exactly. That's what I thought. What? Koribungen. Koribungen. And so, yeah, this went on for a while, and it was this this word that even my Korean friends would ask their friends. And it turns out it was Chorübungen, choir exercises. So it's a church word. Oh. And of course, there will be more like that, because a lot of the church music is German, and there's a lot of Christians in Korea. So there'll be, I'm sure this is not the only one. That is German. So if you go that way, I'm sure you'll find more. But I also like the French ones, sometimes the made up Dutch ones, like Natur ice cream. Why? and if you look at the explanation, they talk about artisanal Dutch, and I was like, what? Anyway, yeah, so the loan words are always a lot of fun. Do you like the group Inalsi? Yes, I do. They're fantastic. Yes. I don't think I should, I can be called a fan, because I don't have time to be a true fan. So I'm like the dirty old man in the back who listens to everything and enjoys it. I'm that dirty ajashi. But I really do appreciate and love the Inalsi. Yes, I do. Have you done any research on music in K-dramas? No, I haven't, because I don't have time for K-dramas. I have I'm about to start watching Squid Game. I haven't actually had time to watch it. So that's, yeah. But I'm not complaining. I love my job. What is the most beautiful Korean word? I don't know. Haven't thought. That's a good question. Probably not with very strong consonants. Probably something with a ria in it, and maybe an or ya sound. Those are very pretty, I think. Yeah, I don't have one, but now I'm gonna think about it, and I might have one in a couple of months. How about dialects in Korea? How does that affect Hangeul? In a K-drama I'm watching, there's a scene where two Koreans can't understand a word of each other. Tea and car, I assume this is dialect thing. Yes, totally. And some of the dialects are hilarious. They're so strong and full of amazing new idioms, and they are complex and have a great history. And I think Koreans have a reason to be very proud of them and preserve them. Whether that means something in terms of the writing, I'm not sure. I suppose they have specific ways of writing some of their sounds, but yeah, all I can say is that they are very strong. I used to be a Assoc student for quite a while, and the husband of the lady who ran the Assoc, he was from Chungcheong province, and I never understood a word he said. He was the loveliest man ever. And he always said, "Sit next to me," and then I sat on the couch for hours, kind of scared of him, as she would kind of layer his hands with what is it, sujichim, acupuncture. And so he would sit in front of the TV like this, kind of looking like Pinhead from Hellraiser, and look at me, and he would say things to me. Not a word ever I understood, but he was the loveliest man. and I understand quite a lot, but not from him. And that wasn't even the famous Busan dialect, which I also love. I mean, how can you not? Why do you think Korean media does class commentary so well? Squid Game, Parasite. Yeah, excellent. I think because hierarchies are very strong in Korea, and there's a lot of pressure on people. There's great inequality. There's Squid Game, for example, maybe an allegory, if you like, for the pressures of the normal family in Korea. A lot of people have debts. A lot of people struggle to even kind of have two children, let alone one. The other way around, have one child, let alone two. And that is, yeah, that's kind of something you see in older movies as well. So these high school horror movies that were popular, what is it, roughly 20 years ago now, like Yogo Kwaedam. Those movies too, they talked about the pressure and the bullying at high schools. And I think a lot of Koreans, they recognize that. There's also wonderful work done by my friend Jo Elfing Hwang at Perth, at UWA, who does work on the portrayal of the average man in the workplace in Korean dramas, which she is very keen on following. And again, that is something that really corresponds or kind of resonates with Korean viewers. Pressure is everywhere. It makes for a very exciting, fun kind of experience when you're there, but as a visitor. But it's hard not to see how tough it is also at the same time. Yeah, I love Korea. I love meeting people, but when I meet people, they're busy. So I tend to meet them late at night for an hour of quick drinking and eating, and it's always wonderful. It's heartfelt, but I know that they're tired, and I think they work quite a bit harder than the average Australian. Let's put it like that. Why S is used for the sound, as in health? So I assume that is in regards to loan words. helse. If that's the question, then I guess that this is again is partly because of choice made by the government to have particular words transcribed in a particular way. It may also be that a similar word is best avoided. So they emphasize a particular sound at the end. For example, you don't want to sound like you're saying hell, for example, which because of a lot of Christians, maybe they want to avoid that. So they really make that final sound very strong. Maybe also one of the possible explanations for this. But I would, it's probably the first that it's just become accepted as part of I guess, the standard way in which to use this particular loanword. Someone says, I still listen to GOD and HOT and I'm only 24 years old. That's, yeah, thank you. If people are happy, I can keep going for a little bit.
It's totally up to you, Professor.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to maybe last couple, and then
yeah. So let me go through. I might have missed one. Will there be a recording available afterwards? Yes, I'm told there will be. So thank you for asking. What influenced Professor's interest in Korean language culture? Oh, but actually, so my grandfather was Chinese, but lived in Indonesia. And so my father was a media person. He made documentaries about Asian people in the Netherlands, where I grew up. And because of that, I became interested in East Asia and Chinese. And so when I went to university, finally, actually already before, I started learning Chinese and Japanese. And so I did a major in Japanese and Korean at first, and eventually dropped Korean, and I did Mongolian as well at some point. So Mongolian, and just focused on Korean in the end. And that was because, and it tends to be like that, because I really liked the way in which it was taught, and no one else was doing it. So I felt a little bit responsible for kind of being the field as a single student. The problem was, of course, that when you are the only student, there is no classroom. So my teacher would call me into his office every day. Can you imagine? Every day. And if you didn't do your homework, then you had nothing to talk about. So it's very embarrassing. So I guess the reason was the education and the experience of education. And then the reason I stuck with it at the very end and didn't become this violinist, as I mentioned before, is because I started to really kind of love being in Korea, and my Korean friends were very, very honest and very passionate, and that made me want to be in this field and engage even more.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we do that one last question, and yeah, we're gonna have to wrap it up after.
Yeah. So there's an interesting one here. That's the last one, and it's actually not one I can answer. Who or when was the order of the alphabet decided? I believe this was decided more or less at the time of the Huminzon, 1446, but it may have been adjusted a little bit later. I'm always surprised that now it seems to follow the exact same order it has in the Japanese dictionary, for example. The Akasata Naha Mairawa, same kind of order in, and I wondered whether that's a coincidence. It probably isn't, but I'm not a linguist. I suspect the order is more or less that of the Huminzongan, which is why you see the K at the beginning, but I'm not really sure. But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Professor, today for time. We were actually planning to finish at around 8:30, went way over time, and I could feel that you could keep going on how much you're actually enjoying all the questions. And all the questions are actually starting, and I was really impressed, and all the comments, I would like to thank everybody. 늦은 시간까지 함께 해주신 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀 전합니다. 안녕히 계세요. 고맙습니다.